He presented an imposing silhouette, tall, stern-faced, a man who had risen from provincial beginnings to become, in the public imagination, one of the Reich's most dreaded figures. That image, of personal menace concentrated in a single body, helps explain the question in the title. What happened to the Nazi leaders whose power was greatly exaggerated? Using Ernst Kaltenbrunner as our central case, this film asks whether the terror associated with names like his was really the product of individual omnipotence, or whether a different, less dramatic reality can be read in the paper trail, departmental turf wars, and final courtroom records. Kaltenbrunner's trajectory was both ordinary and consequential for the Nazi security state. He came from Austria, trained in law, and like many early party activists, built his career inside an illegal movement that depended on discipline, loyalty, and clandestine networks. He joined the Austrian Nazis in the early 1930s, entered the SS soon after, and endured periodic arrests during the years when Nazism was banned in Vienna and other parts of Austria. Those years of underground activity, organizing, taking risks, proving political reliability, are what made him acceptable to senior SS commanders after the Anschluss in 1938. Once Austria was integrated into the Reich, Kaltenbrunner moved quickly into official positions in the security apparatus, advanced through the ranks, and by 1939 had acquired a senior SS grade that put him on a trajectory toward national influence. It was loyalty to Heinrich Himmler, administrative competence, and the willingness to enforce Nazi policies that elevated him from provincial cadre to a central post in Berlin. If this story begins like other biographies of mid-level Nazi functionaries, the significance lies in the institutional role he would later assume, and in the difference between the myth of omnipotence and the nuts-and-bolts reality of running a sprawling security bureaucracy. If you find this kind of forensic history compelling, check our playlist on Nazi intelligence for related deep dives. The office Kaltenbrunner would eventually hold, the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, deserves careful definition because the word security obscures what it actually coordinated. The RSHA was a composite organization. It combined the state police's secret political police, the Gestapo, the criminal police, Kripo, and the intelligence service rooted in the SS, the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD. On paper, the RSHA was a single command, and in political rhetoric its chiefs were sometimes painted as the Reich's inner executioners. In practice, however, the RSHA was a complex bureaucratic organism with competing elements, conflicting priorities, and powerful personalities pulling in different directions. Reinhard Heydrich, who built the office into a central instrument of repression, left a formidable reputation when he was assassinated in 1942. The vacuum his death created did not produce an automatic successor with equivalent authority. Instead, it opened a period in which institutional norms, personal networks, and Himmler's own choices shaped who actually exercised what levers of power. When Kaltenbrunner formally became chief of the RSHA in January 1943, he inherited an organization whose outward appearance of unified command masked considerable internal independence. Administrative files that surfaced at the Nuremberg trials and in subsequent archival releases include directives carrying Kaltenbrunner's name and minute orders from meetings he chaired. Those documents establish that he occupied a senior role in the chain of command. They place his signature on memos and operational correspondence and link him to policy decisions and territorial directives. At the same time, the RSHA's internal reality meant that figures like Heinrich Müller, who ran the Gestapo's operational arm for years, retained significant practical authority over investigations and arrests. Walter Schellenberg, who handled foreign intelligence tasks under the SD umbrella, cultivated contacts and diplomatic channels that were sometimes independent of RSHA formalities. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, remained the patron and final arbiter. His delegation of authority was uneven and contingent. The paper trail therefore reveals a duality, signature and responsibility on one side, and a fragmented operational field where subordinates, competing offices, and Himmler's interventions constrained unilateral power. This duality was not merely theoretical. In wartime, administrative control meant chairing meetings, approving circulars, and stamping orders that carried legal and bureaucratic weight. RSHA records produced at Nuremberg, show Kaltenbrunner's fingerprints on supervisory documents, internal reports, transmission logs, and personnel files that connected the central office to local security departments throughout occupied Europe. Those documents undercut the defense he later mounted at Nuremberg, that he had been a figurehead with little practical say. Confronted with RSHA files bearing his signature and testimony from subordinates and victims, Kaltenbrunner's insistence that he had not personally overseen criminal operations collapsed into the documentary record. Yet the same archives show that many day-to-day decisions, the precise timing of roundups, local methods of policing, the use of informants, were often implemented by regional security chiefs and Gestapo cadres who had long-standing operational experience and relative autonomy. The tensions between central direction and operational autonomy are easier to see when we compare the RSHA's formal map to how orders moved through it. Heydrich had exercised a kind of charismatic managerial force that centralized decision-making in the late 1930s and early 1940s. His assassination deprived the RSHA of that singular force. Himmler, who had final authority, did not always exercise microcontrol, but instead relied on trusted deputies, personal envoys, and a patchwork of institutional delegations. That meant Kaltenbrunner's authority could be decisive in administrative and legal terms, signing regulations, authorizing transfers, reshaping personnel charts, while the actual mechanics of repression remained in practice, distributed among experienced operators. Documents from the RSHA and testimony presented at Nuremberg make clear that delegations were routine. The effect was cumulative. Responsibility accumulated on paper even as operational effectiveness rested with a network. As the Third Reich approached its end, these bureaucratic nuances mattered less for those who had suffered under the security apparatus, and more for the men who had depended on the bureaucracy's cover. After the failed assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20, 1944, security organs intensified their repressive measures, and the RSHA's workload increased. Kaltenbrunner presided over meetings and approvals at a time when terror was both institutional policy and an improvised response to fear. Yet when the Reich itself began to collapse, the centralized image of authority disintegrated quickly. Kaltenbrunner retreated from Berlin into the Alpine region as the front lines dissolved and Central Command lost its grip. On 12 May 1945, he was arrested by agents of the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps. He attempted to conceal his identity, an effort that failed when two women, whose names appear in post-war reports as Countess Gisela von Westarp and Iris Scheidler, identified him. The CIC report of his capture, filed contemporaneously, describes the identification and detention procedures that are now part of the public record. The transition from capture to prosecution is where the myth of omnipotence met the most exposed reality: stacks of documents. At Nuremberg, Kaltenbrunner's defense followed a familiar pattern: deny direct involvement where possible, emphasize delegation and bureaucratic distance where signatures and orders might convey responsibility, and present himself as an administrator carrying out policy from above. The prosecution countered not with rhetoric but with records, RSHA files, transfer orders, lists of units and detachments, and direct witness testimony linking the office he led to policies of persecution. The tribunal did not accept the argument that administrative signature alone absolved moral or criminal responsibility. On October 1, 1946, the International Military Tribunal delivered its judgment. Kaltenbrunner was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death and executed on October 16, 1946. Afterward, as with several other convicted leaders, his cremation and the disposal of his ashes were treated as a kind of symbolic end. Legal accountability, closing the final chapter of personal power, as it had been publicly imagined. Kaltenbrunner's fate is telling precisely because his public myth often exaggerated his personal omnipotence, while the documentary record shows the mechanisms of collective violence. He had real power in the sense that his office could authorize, coordinate, and legalize repressive practices. His signature on RSHA memoranda mattered. But his authority was also constrained by the entrenched experience of career police officers like Heinrich Müller, by the intelligence operations pursued by Schellenberg, and by Himmler's own unpredictable interventions. The impression of a single, all-powerful executioner is a simplification that served both propaganda and the human need to personify evil. Administrative complexity, competing ambitions, and decentralized execution made the reality messier and more revealing about how modern atrocities are organized. It is useful briefly to consider 3 comparative examples that clarify the pattern. Reinhard Heydrich's career produced a near-mythic reputation: brilliant, ruthless, and centrally effective. That reputation, however, was a product of both his managerial style and the propaganda of the early war years. His death froze an image that later observers often amplified beyond what the institutional record would support. Heinrich Müller, who for years ran the Gestapo's operations, exercised practical power that sometimes outstripped formal rank. How autonomous he was in specific decisions is debated. Academics describe that question as contested or indefinido in the sources. Yet it is clear he had deep operational experience and networks that could act independently. Walter Schellenberg, by contrast, cultivated a role in foreign intelligence and diplomatic maneuvering that blurred the line between SD initiative and RSHA policy. His maneuvers show how personal agency and opportunism could at times carve out influence within and across the security organs. Each of these men, like Kaltenbrunner, helps illustrate the central point. Perception of omnipotence was often the product of reputation, propaganda, and simplified narratives, while the archival record reveals a more plural, contested, and administratively driven reality. The question of responsibility remains central. Bureaucratic diffusion does not absolve individuals. The legal and moral judgments after 1945 pivoted on this distinction. Signatures, approvals, and personnel appointments are not neutral clerical acts when they are the mechanism through which policies of persecution are enacted. That is why the RSHA files and trial exhibits were decisive in Nuremberg. They converted institutional complexity into legal accountability. The declassified material released later, including intelligence reviews and government assessments, such as a declassified CIA report dated 22 September 1993, that re-examined wartime intelligence structures, has reinforced the picture that responsibility in the security organs had both individual and systemic dimensions. Bureaucracy can diffuse action, it can also codify it, making the chain of responsibility traceable in ways that myth and rumor cannot undo. What then? Answer the title's central query. Leaders like Kaltenbrunner were powerful, but not omnipotent in the way myth often suggested. Their authority was real in administrative, legal, and symbolic terms. They could set policy, reassign personnel, and shape institutional priorities. Yet that authority was exercised within a dense web of delegated powers, entrenched operational careers, and the political whims of superiors. The aura of omnipotence, of a single hand directing terror from the center, served multiple functions. It simplified public understanding, it personified state violence, and it provided scapegoats or villains in post-war narratives. When historians open the files, the image changes from a solitary executioner to a system in which responsibility was both shared and concentrated, where signatures and directives mattered, but where the effective means of repression often depended on subordinate initiative. There is also a broader analytical point for contemporary observers. Myths about concentrated power can obscure how ordinary administrative processes enable extraordinary crimes. Demonization of individuals can make it easier to imagine evil as an aberration external to institutional routines. The documentary record in Kaltenbrunner's case suggests the inverse. Routine paperwork, personnel lists, meeting minutes, and logistical directives were the architecture of violence. Demystifying the figure at the top is not an exercise in exculpation. Rather, it is a way to understand how systems reproduce harm and how accountability can be traced through documents and procedures. In the end, accountability closed the chapter on Kaltenbrunner's public authority. Arrested as the Reich collapsed, identified despite attempts at concealment, prosecuted with a mass of documentary evidence, and executed under the verdict of the International Military Tribunal. His fate illustrated both the legal potency of archival records and the limits of myth. The story is emblematic. Those whose reputations suggested near-infinite powers often found their reach curtailed by colleagues, by the chaos of war, by institutional fragmentation, and finally by evidence that could be marshaled in a court. If the takeaway feels disquieting, it should. Understanding how bureaucracies enable atrocities places a burden on modern institutions and citizens to recognize the signs when paperwork becomes policy and policy becomes persecution. For further context on how operational officers and foreign intelligence figures functioned within the same system, watch our companion videos on Heinrich Müller and Walter Schellenberg. If this examination helped you see the difference between myth and documentary reality, like the video and subscribe for more historically grounded investigations.